Senator John Kennedy recently dismantled Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez during what became the most embarrassing 40-minute stretch of her professional life. On live TV, AOC flashed a smile at the senator and uttered the exact phrase she should have avoided. Unaware of her misstep, she firmly believed she had the upper hand. This was consistently Ocasio-Cortez's fatal flaw, an inability to distinguish between a crowd eating out of the palm of her hand and the instant she had unknowingly surrendered her own weapon to an opponent. The arrangement was straightforward: a primetime cable television slot, 2 seats, and a single moderator. AOC eagerly agreed to the appearance because the screen was her domain. Armed with 13 million followers and a guaranteed viral soundbite for every news rotation, she never lost a room. Kennedy agreed simply because, as he mentioned to appear beforehand, he merely wanted to pose a few questions. His team had strongly cautioned him against participating, and his wife had bluntly warned him that she would tear him to pieces. Reacting to that, he merely offered a slow smile. Eventually, the anchor presented them to the audience. Ocasio-Cortez was introduced as the youngest female elected to Congress, a transformative figure in the Democratic Party with 13 million loyal fans. Kennedy's introduction was a brief, single phrase, a Republican senator representing Louisiana. This asymmetrical framing was entirely intentional. Kennedy observed the bias, mentally cataloged it, but remained silent. Before the anchor could even complete the opening inquiry, AOC commanded the discussion. She was remarkably skilled, she always had been. She passionately discussed wealth disparities, environmental issues, and blue-collar households forced to decide between paying for insulin or their housing. With every statement, her hands sliced through the space around her, acting like a maestro leading a symphony only she was privy to. Subsequently, she pivoted toward Kennedy. She declared that, respectfully, politicians like him had occupied Washington for decades, yet the only tangible alteration was the typeface used on administrative memos. The anchor gave a nod, intentionally allowing AOC an additional moment of quiet for her words to fully register, and deliberately refrained from requesting Kennedy's immediate rebuttal. This bias was blatantly obvious, and audiences observing from their living rooms across Ohio, Georgia, and Louisiana took notice and held their breath. Kennedy lightly drummed 2 fingers against his knee, gave a measured nod, and allowed the quietness to extend just beyond the point of comfort. Eventually, he remarked that her statement was certainly something. After another pause, he addressed her as Congresswoman, claiming to be just an ordinary man from Louisiana who needed her assistance grasping a few concepts. A smirk crossed AOC's face, assuming he was simply buying time and convinced the evening's victory was already secured. She had just branded him an ancient relic on a live broadcast, yet he was smiling. If you've ever witnessed someone misjudge the most reserved individual in a room, make sure to hit that like button immediately, because what unfolds next is entirely her own doing. Still coasting on the energy of her initial monologue, AOC delivered the statement that ignited the entire confrontation. She boldly declared that her Green New Deal stands as the most sweeping climate policy initiative in U.S. history, asserting that anyone opposing it prioritizes corporate gains over the Earth's survival. She delivered this directly to the viewing audience rather than to Kennedy, speaking with the unwavering conviction of someone who has never been required to prove her calculations. Kennedy simply nodded, acknowledging that he appreciated ambition. He likened it to his grandson, who once proclaimed he would construct a spacecraft from a cardboard appliance box. While he respected the grand idea, he noted he merely had a few inquiries regarding the actual mechanics. A scattering of laughter was heard, though AOC remained stone-faced. He then asked the Congresswoman to guide him through the arithmetic. What is the actual price tag? She retorted that the Green New Deal is a necessary investment in the future, arguing that the true expense lies in climate inaction. He acknowledged her point, but pressed again on the monetary cost of her specific proposal. She began to state that failing to act carries an estimated price. Kennedy's tone remained remarkably even. It never elevated. This was a trait the lenses constantly overlooked, and the written records never truly conveyed his volume actually dropped when he was moving in for the kill. He clarified that he wasn't inquiring about the price of doing nothing, but rather the exact cost of executing her specific blueprint. Instead of providing a concrete figure, she deflected, reverting to the rhetoric of impending catastrophe and crisis that had built her public profile. Kennedy bided his time. Then he meticulously calculated the figures himself, at the deliberate pace of a cashier handling physical currency. He noted that the projections he continually encountered, hovered around $93 trillion. Considering there are roughly 330 million American citizens, dividing that total equates to approximately $280,000 per individual. He then stated gently that regardless of what Boston University's economics department might instruct, in his neck of the woods, presenting someone with a $280,000 invoice usually prompts them to ask what exactly they are purchasing. AOC's hands immediately sprang into motion the signature movement her 13 million followers had witnessed countless times. Those familiar hands sliced, pointed, and directed the air. She passionately argued that the issue was the very survival of the globe, claiming people were perishing and minority neighborhoods were being ravaged by environmental inequities, all while he sat there treating the division of numbers like a trivial sport. Kennedy remained entirely motionless, allowing her elevated volume to wash over him akin to a man on a veranda, calmly enduring a passing rain squall. Once the room returned to silence, he responded. He calmly stated that he heard her, but pointed out that he had asked for a specific cost, whereas her response was that people were dying, noting those are two completely distinct statements. The anchor interjected, suggesting to the senator that climate strategies encompass far more than mere mathematics. Without even glancing at the moderator, Kennedy agreed, but emphasized that the numerical aspect represents the moment someone must physically issue a payment. And those potential payers were currently watching the broadcast. Ocasio-Cortez glared at Kennedy, akin to a prizefighter staring down an adversary who simply declines to throw a counterpunch. She was engineered for direct conflict and high volume, thriving in the type of verbal warfare where the swiftest talker prevails. Kennedy, however, wasn't engaging in a brawl. He was simply calculating, and she was entirely unequipped to strike a man wielding a computational device rather than closed fists. As she always did when her footing grew unstable, she drastically shifted her approach, pivoting directly into an offensive assault. She sharply told the senator that his flaw was sitting in his seat, cracking jokes, making appearances on Fox News, and never accomplishing a single thing for the working class. She passionately recounted her origins, stating she emerged from poverty, worked as a bartender, and served patrons who exerted more effort in a single shift than he did in an entire month. She declared that she battled on behalf of the working class every single day, and admittedly her delivery hit its mark. It struck with the formidable weight of genuine anger and authentic memories of real tables she had waited on, real beverages she had served, and actual gratuities she had tallied after exhausting shifts. The moderator nodded in agreement. The atmosphere of the studio heavily favored AOC, and for a fleeting instant she perfectly embodied her strongest persona, a beacon of righteous indignation. Kennedy offered a slow nod of agreement, conceding that her assessment was accurate. He hadn't successfully championed many massive legislative packages. He noted with a touch of self-deprecation that his spouse had been pointing that out to him for 3 decades. A ripple of laughter moved through the studio, though Kennedy himself remained entirely serious. He then addressed her directly, pointing out that she had just claimed to fight tirelessly for everyday workers. After a brief pause, he noted that everyday workers are the ones who actually pay for their own attire. AOC's facial expression visibly altered as she uttered a defensive, "Excuse me." Kennedy brought up the Met Gala, complimenting the stunning nature of her "Tax the Rich" gown. He remarked that while the slogan was witty, the entry pass to that specific gathering cost $35,000. He highlighted that her gown, her hairstyling, and her cosmetics were all provided completely free of charge. Furthermore, when the House Ethics Committee determined she hadn't appropriately covered some of those expenses, her defense was to cast the blame onto her staff's mishandling of the situation. Kennedy interjected, informing her that he too had spent time tending bar. The atmosphere in the room suddenly grew intensely quiet, as no one had anticipated that revelation. He recounted it as a long-ago summer gig, explaining that if the cash register didn't balance at closing time, the proprietor didn't blame the employees. He took responsibility himself because he owned the establishment. He allowed that point to linger in the air. He then deduced that when she preaches about fighting for laborers, yet attends an event priced higher than an average vehicle, sporting complimentary garments demanding taxation of the wealthy, and subsequently scapegoats her aides when the invoice arrives, those very laborers watching from home take notice. They notice because they are responsible for purchasing their own clothing and are never handed complimentary $35,000 admission passes to any event. Once more, AOC's hands flew upward, moving with increased speed and breadth. She argued that the core issue was deeply rooted systemic inequality, accusing the senator of attempting to shrink an entire social movement down to a mere piece of clothing. Kennedy remained exceptionally patient, resembling an angler calmly waiting by a completely enclosed body of water. She had proclaimed her dedication to the working class. He simply inquired about who footed the bill for her extravagant dress. If you've spent your entire existence handling your own financial obligations while observing individuals who don't do the same, lecture you regarding equity, drop the word receipt in the comments section and subscribe immediately, because her subsequent retaliation utilizes her most potent ammunition, and it comes incredibly close to succeeding. Ocasio-Cortez ceased her hand movements. Her vocal tone lowered, and the look in her eyes transformed into something far more genuine and menacing, replacing her previous anger. She leaned in, asking if he truly wanted to challenge her moral integrity. She pointed out that he had been entrenched in the political arena since she was merely in kindergarten. Over those 30 years, she noted, his home state of Louisiana continuously suffered from one of the most severe poverty metrics in the nation. She accused him of never having successfully authored a single piece of substantial legislation that was enacted into law. She charged that he simply appeared on broadcasts, entertained audiences, collected his sound bites, and then returned to a jurisdiction where children suffer from starvation. This was no longer a theatrical display she was actively battling. She recounted arriving in Congress at the age of 29, burdened by student loans, lacking wealth, political lineage, or backing from prestigious law firms. Yet she boasted that during her initial term, she championed the most massive environmental legislation in U.S. history, pushed for the expansion of the child tax credit that elevated millions out of destitution, and compelled the nation to confront topics it had avoided for decades. Holding his gaze steadily, she told the senator he could remain seated and calculate massive figures, but she had been exponentially increasing her real-world impact since her very first day. This counterattack struck with more force than anything she had uttered the entire evening. By using the phrase multiplying impact, she effectively hijacked Kennedy's own mathematical analogy and reflected it back at him. The anchor nodded, the studio's energy shifted, and for a pristine 15 seconds, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez appeared to secure a lasting victory. The moderator then pivoted to Kennedy, noting that the Congresswoman raised a valid critique regarding his legislative history. The anchor asked what significant laws he had personally guided to passage over his 3-decade career. The home audience witnessed it once more, the moderator actively assisting AOC, honing her metaphorical weapon, and supplying her with additional ammunition. Viewers who had seen this exact scenario play out on countless other programs felt a familiar frustration building as it was unfolding right before their eyes once again. Yet, they remained glued to the screen because the elderly gentleman from Louisiana remained firmly in his seat, continuing to lightly tap his knee, his volume completely steady. Kennedy sat motionlessly before giving a nod. His subsequent response was delivered softer than any prior statement that night. He conceded she was correct. Louisiana suffered from massive, complex problems, and he openly admitted he had not remedied all of them or even the majority of them. After a pause, he quipped again that his wife could have confirmed that, having reminded him of it for 30 years. A gentle laughter swept through the room, the kind elicited when someone invites you to chuckle alongside them, rather than at someone else. Kennedy's expression, however, remained resolute. He then confessed to the Congresswoman what had been troubling him throughout the evening whenever he posed a direct inquiry. She responded with an elaborate oration. He genuinely complimented her rhetorical skills, declaring her the most talented orator he had encountered during his 30 years in the Capitol. However, he emphasized that grand speeches do not cover rental payments. He pointed out that everyday citizens currently sitting at their dining tables with outdated calculators are entirely capable of basic mathematics. They perform these calculations monthly to cover housing, food, fuel, utilities, and prescriptions necessities that remain unaffected by media headlines. When their budgets fall short, they don't deliver dramatic monologues. Instead, they make sacrifices, bypass certain needs, and are forced to tell their children, maybe next month. That, he stated, is the reality of authentic mathematics. These individuals have managed these hardships silently for decades, all while televised pundits insist that the underlying numbers are irrelevant. Staring directly into the camera lens rather than at AOC, he affirmed that these citizens are neither foolish nor outdated relics of a forgotten era. They are present, executing the exact same survival strategies they employed in previous months, succeeding without applause, social media followers, or magazine features, just for settling their utility invoices promptly. And they are utterly exhausted by being instructed that they are asking the wrong questions by individuals who have never been forced to sit at that same table and painfully decide between paying for heating or groceries. Pausing, he delivered a message explicitly meant for the viewing audience rather than his opponent. He noted that when someone finally voices these exact questions publicly, the viewers won't be shocked by the responses because they've inherently known them for years. They were simply waiting for a figure with a platform to articulate it. Every specific inquiry is met with a theatrical monologue, and while the monologue may sound spectacular, the core question remains fundamentally ignored. If you have spent years yelling at your screen demanding to know the true cost of these plans, hit subscribe immediately. AOC was preparing to deliver one final assertion, and the senator was gearing up to counter it with a hushed, critical tale that required close attention. Continuing her aggressive push without careful consideration, AOC casually dropped a statement that often proves fatal for politicians, treating a metaphorical explosive like a mundane piece of furniture. She proudly announced to the senator that she was entirely funded by everyday people, completely free of corporate PAC contributions. She insisted this was the core of her identity and brand, and a standard that nobody on his side of the political spectrum could match. Kennedy showed no visible reaction and did not immediately jump on the statement. Instead, he did the unexpected. He reclined in his seat and began weaving a narrative. His tone shifted to a slower, more inviting cadence, reminiscent of a man relaxing on a patio at dusk, simply conversing without an agenda. He shared with the Congresswoman that he once had a buddy, an honorable man who operated a modest plumbing supply enterprise down in Madisonville. The man labored 7 days a week for 2 decades, maintained immaculate financial records, settled debts with suppliers punctually, and never carried a balance. However, the man was oblivious to the fact that his spouse managed the bookkeeping on a computing device older than AOC's entire political tenure. Kennedy offered a smile that failed to extend to his eyes. He explained that his buddy eventually recruited a sharp, intelligent individual brimming with grandiose concepts, the sort of concepts that make a small-town proprietor envision massive expansion. His friend, naturally drawn to this vision, handed over the reins to this ambitious employee. This individual subsequently established an auxiliary corporation and began shuffling funds between various accounts via multiple LLCs. While the primary ledgers appeared pristine, roughly $885,000 was simultaneously funneled through obscure entities for vague, strategic consulting services. A phrase Kennedy noted typically translates to a refusal to disclose actual activities. Upon discovering this, the proprietor confronted the ambitious employee, demanding to know where the capital vanished. The employee merely repeated strategic consulting. When pressed for clarification, the individual simply vanished, abandoning his position without even clearing his workspace. Following a significant pause, Kennedy addressed the Congresswoman directly, pointing out that her own chief of staff, Mr. Chakrabarty, had founded an entity called Brand New Congress LLC. Through this organization, he funneled $885,000 sourced from political action committees they both managed. The Federal Election Commission launched an inquiry, with the former chairman stating there was sufficient grounds for criminal proceedings, which culminated in Mr. Chakrabarty's resignation. Kennedy gazed at her with a remarkably gentle, almost non-accusatory demeanor, comparable to a physician delivering unfortunate medical results. He stated his assumption that a perfectly reasonable justification existed, yet highlighted the contradiction her social media profile still boasted of being 100% grassroots funded, despite the undeniable movement of those funds and the subsequent departure of the staffer responsible. He clarified he was merely reciting an anecdote and asked her if the details rang a bell. The studio's dynamic had irreversibly changed. The anchor failed to intervene, did not steer the conversation elsewhere, and provided no safety net for AOC. For the absolute first time that evening, the moderator remained motionless, staring at the Congresswoman and waiting, mirroring the anticipation of the audience at home. AOC's hands rose once more, though the movement was distinctly slower and less expansive. She deflected by asserting that conservatives possessed hundreds of millions in undisclosed funds, explicitly naming the Koch brothers and the Heritage Foundation. In a highly subdued voice, Kennedy reminded her that his question pertained to her chief of staff, not the Koch brothers. Before the tension could dissipate, AOC committed her ultimate error. Faced with crumbling footing, she instinctively reached for her most reliable rhetorical weapon, the specific argument that propelled her to stardom in 2019 and dominated progressive media ever since. She invoked the southern border. She angrily stated that the current administration was confining children in cages. Kennedy quickly interrupted to confirm that she had indeed made that claim previously. He clarified that she used those precise terms on an Instagram broadcast in 2019, declaring to the public that America was operating concentration camps at its southern boundary. She had utilized the solemn phrase, "never again." Kennedy revealed that her specific phrasing had caused him sleepless nights, as his own father had battled in a global conflict over the true meaning of those words. He entirely agreed with the gravity of that phrase. He then noted that when legislation reached the House floor, a $4.5 billion package dedicated to humanitarian relief, improved living standards, and medical services, precisely the elements she claimed were absent, she voted against it. He emphasized that the proposed law was explicitly crafted to rectify every single deficiency she had highlighted. After a pause, he asked her directly, why did she cast a no vote? A profound silence enveloped the room for 7 seconds. It was the most extended lull of the entire broadcast, so quiet that the hum of the climate control system and the subtle movements of a camera person were audible. AOC began to argue that the legislation contained stipulations that would have expanded certain powers. Kennedy remained unshakable, as steady as a submerged rock. He calmly recounted that she had broadcasted to the nation that these facilities were concentration camps, invoked the phrase, "never again," yet when the necessary funding was presented, she rejected it. After a brief silence, he delivered a crushing blow. She didn't actually want to solve the problem. She merely wanted to talk about it. Those specific words hung heavily in the studio atmosphere. Everyone present and watching intuitively grasped the implication. It signified that America's most prominent progressive figure had leveraged the tragedy of the Holocaust strictly for media visibility, only to subsequently vote against the very funding designed to alleviate the crisis she loudly mourned. She did this not because the legislation was fundamentally flawed, but because voting affirmatively doesn't generate viral traction. Only pure outrage and fiery rhetoric go viral, and her entire professional trajectory was constructed upon that exact fire. AOC parted her lips, attempting to vocalize a defense beginning with, "children were." However, the thought remained incomplete. For the very first instance that evening, she voluntarily halted her own speech. It wasn't due to an interruption, but rather because the phrasing simply perished in her throat, replaced by absolute emptiness. The anchor, adopting a cautious and gentle tone, invited the Congresswoman to respond to the senator's inquiry regarding her voting record. Every single viewer witnessed this monumental pivot. The same anchor who initially lavished AOC with a multi-paragraph introduction while granting Kennedy a mere sentence, the same moderator who had validated every monologue, deflected every hard question, provided AOC with extended silences, and cut off Kennedy twice. That very same host had just pivoted to Ocasio-Cortez and demanded she directly address the question. Not a deflection, not an easier variation, but the exact same inquiry Kennedy had relentlessly pursued for 40 minutes. Home audiences across Louisiana, Ohio, and regions the moderator had never set foot in felt a profound shift. For the first time in recent memory, the broadcast apparatus appeared to align with their perspective. Kennedy gazed at AOC with an expression nearing sorrow rather than fury. He stated that he had observed a distinct pattern throughout the night. With that single sentence, viewers mentally retraced the entire 40-minute exchange. When asked about the cost of her plan, she proclaimed people were perishing, her arms spread wide. When asked who funded her gala attire, she cried systemic inequality, her hands making sharp, decisive cuts. When questioned about the missing LLC funds, she deflected to the Koch brothers, her gestures shrinking. When pressed on her no vote, she started to mention children, her hands halting abruptly. 4 direct inquiries resulted in 4 elaborate speeches, but 0 concrete answers. The iconic hands that tens of millions had watched command countless debates had progressively stilled, as if acknowledging defeat. Kennedy observed that every time he posed a question, she delivered a fiery headline, yet the core question remained unaddressed, lingering like an unopened invoice on a kitchen counter. 4 questions, 4 monologues, absolutely 0 answers, with each monologue increasing in volume except for the final one, which she failed to complete. Share this video with someone who needs to witness it, because there is a final act. AOC remained silent for an extended period. When she finally vocalized, the theatricality had vanished. Her tone was deeper, unpolished, and undeniably sincere, compelling everyone to lean in closely as it revealed the genuine human behind the media persona. She recounted losing her father to cancer at 19, nearly losing their family residence and working brutal double shifts in the service industry. She spoke of suffocating student debt and explained that she pursued political office because the halls of power lacked representation for the everyday people she previously served. Her voice hitched with emotion, and she allowed it to do so. She admitted her imperfections but insisted she hadn't come to Washington to be flawless. She came to be vociferous because her constituents were being ignored. She described residents in her district juggling multiple jobs, struggling with rent, and skipping meals to feed their children. She fiercely promised to yell every single day if that's what it took to force the nation to acknowledge them. The delivery was undeniably authentic, or so incredibly close to it that any distinction was irrelevant. The moderator stared down at her own hands. Kennedy remained unmoving, and even a camera operator briefly lowered his equipment out of respect for the raw humanity displayed in the studio. She had bared her soul her father's passing. The grueling labor, the immense struggle, and the authenticity was palpable. Yet, the senator did not budge. He sat patiently, waiting, and his subsequent response is precisely why this exchange will remain culturally significant a decade from now. Turn on notifications to catch every word. Kennedy allowed the quiet to linger, refusing to rush. When he finally spoke, his vocal quality lacked the southern charm, the comedic edge, or the analytical coldness he had previously employed. Beneath it all, he sounded exactly like a man who had personally experienced the anxiety of staring at an unpayable bill at his own dining table. For the first time, his words seemed to carry a personal, emotional toll. He addressed her as Congresswoman, stating unequivocally that he believed her. He validated the tragedy of her father, the grueling double shifts, the reality of a youth tackling immense debt and entering Congress at 29. He sincerely stated it was a narrative worthy of immense respect, and he wasn't simply offering platitudes. He momentarily glanced at his own hands before re-engaging. He then drew a critical distinction: generating volume is not equivalent to actively listening, and yelling on behalf of a constituency is not the same as providing them with actual solutions. He noted that in his community, words carry absolute weight. If you make a promise, you fulfill it, not for the cameras or social media algorithms, but because your personal integrity is the singular possession no one can strip from you. He emphasized that this was the foundation of his upbringing, as well as the upbringing of the vast majority of the viewing audience. He recapped the evening. He had presented 4 clear questions regarding the price of her legislation, the benefactor of her gown, the destination of her staffers' funds, and the rationale behind her humanitarian vote. In return, she provided 4 beautifully crafted speeches capable of generating immense fame. However, the everyday citizens watching from home, the non-famous, uncelebrated people she purported to represent, were still desperately awaiting a factual response. His gaze was devoid of anger or gloating, replaced by a profound gentleness reserved for moments when one wishes the harsh reality could be altered. He concluded by stating she possessed a retort for everything, except the actual question. Those 10 words settled into the atmosphere like a rock sinking to the floor of a deep reservoir. It didn't create a massive disturbance, but rather a subtle, definitive sound that only underscored the immense silence that had permeated the room. AOC remained seated, and what unfolded next was captured by every lens and permanently etched into the public consciousness. It wasn't a spoken phrase, but the profound absence of one. Her hands, the very hands that had frantically sliced the air for 40 minutes, pointed aggressively at her opponent, gestured theatrically to the audience, and orchestrated every syllable of her rhetoric with instinctual precision. The same hands viewed millions of times, synonymous with her combative brand, which never ceased motion because their owner relentlessly battled. Those iconic hands slowly descended into her lap, resting flat against her trousers. They weren't balled into fists, nor were they preparing for a counter-argument. They were completely inert. It was the physical stillness that occurs when the physical form comprehends a defeat that the mind has yet to articulate. It resembled a complex mechanism powering down gently, recognizing that its energy reserves had been completely depleted for quite some time. The anchor waited. The broadcast equipment waited. Her massive following waited. Yet, she remained mute. The political figure who had never once lacked a snappy comeback sat paralyzed on a live broadcast, completely devoid of words. This wasn't due to insults, shouting matches, or name-calling tactics she was expertly trained to counter. It was simply because her adversary had calmly inquired and then patiently waited. And that patient waiting persisted, as unyielding as basic math and as silent as a debt notice on a counter, refusing to vanish. The moderator gently cleared her throat and asked the senator if he had any closing remarks. Kennedy adjusted his posture and politely declined, stating that he believed the mathematics spoke for themselves. That 10-second video fragment propagated everywhere before the studio equipment even had a chance to power down. A mere 10 seconds inflicted more political damage than 3 decades of dedicated opposition research. Kennedy delivering his final 10 words, followed by AOC's hands falling in total silence. Senator Ted Cruz published a brief forward reaction within the hour. Someone independently verified the calculations. Elon Musk shared the snippet without any accompanying text as no commentary was required. The arithmetic had been universally confirmed. A prominent conservative pundit known for relentlessly criticizing AOC shared a surprisingly uncharacteristic post that evening. It wasn't a barb or a taunt, but a simple observation he had never witnessed an individual secure a victory in a confrontation merely by posing inquiries and executing basic division. This observation was circulated 400,000 times before dawn. The following morning, in a corridor just outside a broadcasting center, a 3-term Democratic lawmaker who served alongside AOC leaned against a wall and confided in a journalist, actively avoiding direct eye contact. He confessed that her fundamental flaw mirrored the flaw of their entire political cohort. He admitted they had mastered the art of theatrical performance, but entirely failed to learn how to provide substantive answers. The fatal flaw of political theater, he noted, is its effectiveness instantly crumbles the moment someone simply sits quietly and applies basic mathematics. He quietly added, while staring at the ground, that at that point the charade is over. He stressed that she herself wasn't the core issue, she was merely the pioneer of this specific rhetorical formula. He predicted a wave of successors younger, more boisterous, and highly skilled in these tactics who would continuously dominate unless opponents began demanding mathematical accountability. He then abruptly departed before the journalist could even activate their recording device. The provided excerpt serves as the narrative's powerful denouement, functioning not merely as an epilogue to a political clash, but as a philosophical thesis on the current state of American civic discourse. Through a series of sharp juxtapositions, the author dissects the fundamental disconnect between the hyper-emotional, performative arena of cable news and the cold, unyielding reality of everyday domestic life. The passage operates on 3 distinct analytical levels: the collapse of the media echo chamber, the framing of the politician as an ordinary craftsman, and the elevation of the calculator as the ultimate arbiter of objective truth. The excerpt opens with a shift away from the primary combatants, turning the lens toward the media apparatus that typically sustains political theater. The post-debate televised discussion represents the broader ecosystem of punditry, where rhetoric is usually spun into victory regardless of the factual outcome. However, the narrative immediately subverts this expectation. When a pundit attempts to defend the Congresswoman by citing her extraordinarily influential platform, the defense is instantly dismantled by a co-anchor who notes that a platform does not equate to a concrete strategy. This brief exchange is profoundly significant. It highlights the modern political fallacy of confusing a megaphone with a blueprint. A platform generates volume, but it does not generate solutions. The author emphasizes the totality of this defeat through the pundit's physical reaction. They reconsider and fall silent. The text notes that there was simply no counter-argument to revisit. This silence is the narrative equivalent of a structural collapse. The numbers had been crunched, and the inquiries had been levied, stripping away the protective layer of outrage that usually shields performative politics. The swiftness with which the conversation moves on demonstrates how fragile a brand built entirely on spectacle truly is once it is exposed to the friction of basic arithmetic. Following the collapse of the pundit's defense, the narrative cuts back to the studio, focusing entirely on the senator's exit. Here, the author employs brilliant characterization through action, sharply contrasting Kennedy's demeanor with the dopamine-driven behaviors typical of the modern digital era. Kennedy removes his lapel microphone using both hands, an action the author explicitly likens to a craftsman returning a borrowed implement. This metaphor is doing heavy thematic lifting. It strips the political debate of its gladiatorial glamour and reframes it as manual labor, a simple, practical job that required the right tool. Kennedy does not view the television studio as a stage for his ego. He views it as a temporary workspace. Once the job of doing the math is complete, the tool is returned. Furthermore, the author lists the things Kennedy explicitly avoids doing. He issues no formal press release, takes no celebratory lap, and drafts no social media update. In an era where politicians act as digital influencers, constantly monetizing their wins for viral engagement, Kennedy's refusal to participate in the aftermath is portrayed as an act of profound dignity. He does not even look back at the vacant seats or the dormant camera lenses. The cameras, once the source of his opponent's power, are rendered powerless and dormant by his indifference. Instead, his primary concern is a deeply domestic one, the fact that he kept his wife waiting. This domestic grounding intentionally shrinks the grandiosity of the television studio, proving that the real world exists outside the frame of the camera. The narrative reaches its thematic climax when Kennedy returns to his home in Louisiana. The setting transitions from the sterile, high-stakes environment of the broadcasting facility to the intimate warmth of a dining room table. Resting on this table is the central symbol of the entire narrative, a simple calculating device. The author personifies this calculator by defining it by what it cannot do. It is utterly incapable of frantic gestures, impassioned monologues, or generating viral trends on social media applications. By contrasting the machine with the highly emotional traits of modern political discourse, the author establishes the calculator as the ultimate, incorruptible judge of reality. While human beings can be swayed by tears, anger, and moral grandstanding, the calculator is immune to sentiment. The specific math mentioned, dividing 93 trillion by 330 million, serves as an anchor to reality. The machine recognizes only one indisputable fact: a quotient exists, and that quotient represents a financial burden that someone, somewhere, is obligated to shoulder. The author uses the phrase, regardless of how deafening the surrounding noise becomes, to finalize the thesis. Noise, volume, and viral outrage cannot alter mathematical law. The calculator represents the quiet, stubborn persistence of reality in the face of performative fiction. In the final paragraph, the narrative voice shifts dramatically, breaking the fourth wall to address the reader directly. This is a deliberate rhetorical strategy known as a call to action, but it functions as much more than a simple plea for digital engagement. It is a validation of the everyday citizen. The author asks the reader to forward the narrative to an individual who sits at their own table every single month, meticulously calculating expenses. This draws a direct, unbroken line from the senator's dining room table to the viewer's kitchen table. The text celebrates the quiet dignity of the working class who survive without cameras, digital followings, or media attention. They are armed only with a calculator, an invoice, and the silent realization that the most boisterous individual in the room rarely provides the actual solution. By ending the narrative on this note, the author transforms the preceding political debate from a partisan skirmish into a moral victory for the responsible, unsung citizen. The senator is no longer just a politician. He is an avatar for every person who has ever had to balance a household budget while being lectured to by out-of-touch elites. The final sentence, "Finally, someone vocalized that truth clearly in 10 simple words, and those words were always meant for you," delivers a powerful emotional catharsis. It tells the reader that they are seen, that their quiet struggles are valid, and that the unyielding truth of their daily arithmetic has finally triumphed over the hollow noise of the television screen.